Thanks, everybody, for coming in today. Um, This meeting was called in anticipation of, there's been some chatter on the unemployment bill that we passed a few, man, it's kind of loud. Bill that we passed a year ago and 2 years ago and 3 years ago, the Phil Bill 1, Phil Bill 2, and Phil Bill 3. And there were some changes done in appropriations last year that made some effect that we're going to talk about today. And then talk about some of the things we still have left to do this upcoming session. And so I figured we'd get in here before session started and just at least have a discussion on it. And so I think since our last meeting, we haven't had a meeting in a year and a half or 2 years. And since that meeting, or right in between there, I was with Madam Secretary and Phil out in Spokane, Washington. The state of Kansas won an award. What was that award called, Phil?
Best in the nation.
Something like that. So, but anyway, we won an award for all the work we've done, and hopefully we can continue to keep doing that work. So thanks, everybody, for all your help and for weighing in on this important matter. We'll go ahead and start with the first person on the agenda, and I think that is Madam Secretary to just kind of give us a quick update on where we're at on the new system and how things are working.
Great.
Secretary.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Tarwater and members of the committee. Again, I'm Secretary Amber Schultz with the Kansas Department of Labor. Before I get started, I just wanted to recognize some staff I have in the audience with me today. So I have Deputy Secretary Amy Selm, our Unemployment Insurance Director Troy Bell, our Chief of Tax Nicole Struckoff, Deputy Chief Counsel Todd Thornburg, and I would also lastly like to introduce our brand new Government Affairs Liaison, Nigel Haben. He is the new Julie, but we have to stop calling him that. I'm thinking he's starting to get a complex. So again, I just wanted to take a moment to thank this committee for all of their support and contributions that we've had during this journey. So as the chairman mentioned today, I'll briefly highlight some of the information and our progress since our go live of Ute. So you can follow along using this sheet. We've got a front and a back here, and it's also all available on our website. So we officially kicked off this unemployment modernization in June of 2022, and we went live November 19th, 2024, so just over a year ago. It was the fastest wholesale implementation of any state at 29 months. And since then, we have seen significant and sustained positive momentum across multiple fronts on our system. And as the chairman mentioned, we have also become an award-winning system. However, Chairman, I believe that award was presented to you for your contributions towards the modernization effort. So Amazon Web Services recognized us with the AWS Champions Award for making the system faster, more user-friendly, more scalable, and for improving self-service for Kansans. In addition, the National Association of State CIOs honored us with its IT Recognition Award for Digital Experience. And that award is really significant to us because it is awarded by our peers. And we were selected as one of 10 out of 130 submissions nationwide for our efforts. Moving on down the sheet, we wanted to highlight a few things related to employers. Kansas has approximately 85,000 employers, of which about 81,000 are contributing employers, which means they pay into the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund. As a reminder, the taxable wage base increased to $15,100 from $14,000 this year. And going forward, the wage base will adjust annually based on growth of the Kansas average wage rather than remaining fixed. By statute, KDOL is required to submit an annual certification of the solvency and adequacy of the trust fund by December 1st. So in simple terms, what this means is, as it answers the question, if a recession were to hit today, how long could the trust fund continue paying unemployment benefits without running out of money? In 2025, the trust fund was certified as solvent. So at current levels, that means that the trust fund is sufficient to pay benefits for 1 year and 8 months based on the average highest benefit payout experienced over the last 20 years. So think of the Great Recession, the pandemic. Just a real quick call out, the employer services section of our website includes the effective contribution schedules for this year and the the prior 4 years, along with the annual cost per employee for that same period. And it also includes all of the computation data related to the trust fund. Again, it is all current and publicly available. And finally, one last addition I want to highlight is that we have created an employer relations team, which serves as a single point of contact for our employers and our organized labor. So moving on, about halfway through the page, since the launch of Youth, we have seen significant and measurable improvements for claimants, employers, and the overall system performance. The system is currently performing at the highest practical level of uptime with almost little to no unplanned downtime. Another primary objective of this effort was to expand our claimant self-service, and we are happy to announce that about 90% of our unemployment insurance claims are now completed through the self-service portions of our portal. And referring again to your information sheet near the bottom of the first sheet and over on the first part of the back sheet, I would like to highlight some information about our contact center. As we all recall, our customer service representatives perform very demanding work. And since 2024, our turnover has stabilized with a reduction in total separations. And this turnover is driven now by involuntary separations rather than employee resignations. And it's important to note this because retaining trained and experienced staff retains that institutional knowledge and reduces the time and costs associated with our onboarding new employees. And again, staff retention also supports expanded training, skill development, and long-term career growth opportunities within our agency. So there's about 100 of our folks in the contact center taking calls, making decisions, and supporting the benefits team. And most importantly, the system has enabled our contact center to handle a higher volume of calls while both reducing hold times and average call handle times and improving the overall efficiency. On the back side of the page, about halfway down, we're going to discuss the My Reemployment Plan, which you all recall is a required program designed to support claimants as they re-enter the workforce. And claimants are required to enroll after receiving 3 weeks of unemployment benefits. Enrollment must be completed within 14 days and includes things like logging into their account on the ks.gov website, uploading and publishing a resume, and completing a job plan. Failure to complete all of these required steps could result in either delayed or loss of unemployment insurance benefits. So in 2025, more than 14,000 claimants were selected to enroll in MRP, and of those, 8,000 experienced a delay or loss in benefits due to noncompliance. And some of these folks did actually come back into compliance, just as a reminder. Integrity. Integrity of our systems, our data, our people are paramount to the state and to the agency. And so our integrity programs are built on industry best practices on 3 pillars to prevent, detect, and recover. Prevention starts with multiple layers of system and architecture protection. We maintain, as an agency, a very light attack service. We only have a few dozen websites, and of those, only a handful where you can actually create an account. For those that do require accounts, we use a suite of tools to prevent fraudulent accounts and account hijacking. Detection occurs typically after identity verification. As we adjudicate those claims, we employ multiple methods to identify and stop those bad actors. And this includes things like working with employers to validate that unemployment insurance claim, cross-matching with state, federal, and other national partners to ensure that claimants are not deceased, not incarcerated, using false Social Security numbers, or listed on the U.S. Treasury's Do Not Pay list. Then recovery addresses both fraudulent and non-fraudulent improper payments. And so we utilize process such as liens, levies, prosecution, and restitution to recover those funds. Lastly, we work very closely with the Kansas Information Security Office, or the KSO, employing a combination of technology, training, and policy to safeguard our systems. We're also subject to a variety of audits from various federal agencies and state agencies, and all of those audit findings are addressed with plans that prioritize our risk based on probability and potential impact. So what is the future of the Ute system? It is continually evolving. Our unemployment insurance system has to keep pace with changes in technology, federal requirements, employer needs, claimant expectations, and emerging fraud tactics. We will continue to add functionality for our employers and claimants, strengthen that fraud prevention, and enhance the overall system performance. Because we have seen that past pauses in modernization has left the system increasingly outdated, and it was just simply not able to serve Kansas in their most dire time of need. And as I've said all throughout this project, that our goal is to ensure that Kansas is never in a position where it cannot meet the needs of those Kansans. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to stand for questions.
Okay, so before I open for questions, I just have one question in 27 subparts. I just wanted to say that well, I guess my question would be this. I'm looking at the most recent unemployment report that came out, I think today or yesterday. And can you tell me what percentage of, in the call matrix section, what percentage of people we helped last week in all the calls you got?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So last week, we did answer 100% of our calls, and we have been doing that for about a year now.
There you go. Right. And so I wanted to start with that. When you took this position, I believe we were in the 20s on people that we could help, and there were thousands of missed calls. And you walked into a very unfair situation, and we did everything we could to chew you up.
Remind me.
And, yeah, and you stuck with it, and you had a vision, and you pushed through it, and I want to thank you for that. Thanks for putting up with me and my committee, and answering the bell every dang time, even though you knew what you were in for. And we really appreciate all the work, and that award that I accepted in Spokane, it was for me. I wanted Phil to say what it was. It was integrity in unemployment. And that's the only time I'll ever win anything like that. But as I said then, it's all on you, and it's on this team. And so all these awards go to everybody, not just individuals, because of the work that was done in this room and the work that's been done over at your office. So thank you very much for that. I'll open for questions. Senator Tyson.
Thank you. No question, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to echo what you had said, and thank you, Secretary Schultz. Really appreciated. As an IT person, you couldn't have paid me enough to take that, and you stepped up, and you really did. You managed the project in a big way and led by example. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Hope Julie's listening out there somewhere.
Thank you very much for the kind words. It has been a rough road ahead. I have an amazing staff that work with me, and so that means a lot. I will definitely pass the message on to those who are not listening.
Okay, welcome, sir. You got here just in time. All right, so I'm seeing no further questions. We'll move on to the next part of our presentation, and that is to hear real quick overview of the motion that I spoke about earlier that was made in the conference committee of the Appropriations and Ways and Means Conference Committee, and basically what it does.
Yep. Good afternoon, Council. My name is Stephen Wu. I'm a fiscal analyst with Legislative Research. My remarks will be summarized in this memo you'll have. It's just one page front and back. So this is language that was inserted into the budget bill last year. It was inserted into SB 125. It applies to fiscal year 26 only. So at the end of June 30, 2026, this provision will expire. For some quick background, this language was originally added on the Senate side on the floor debate. Once we got to conference, the House Committee on Appropriations and the Senate Committee on Ways and Means, they conferred, and some additional language was added. So what does this language include? Well, it covers, it covers employees that meet 4 criteria. First, it covers employees that are covered by a collective bargaining agreement, that have been laid off from lack of work, have worked full-time for their employer, and reasonably expect to return to full-time work with that employer within 6 months. So what does this mean for those that are covered by this provision? Well, The first is that it extends the return to work window to 6 months from the very bottom baseline of 8 weeks. Second, it waives some work search requirements as well as the requirement to enroll with the My Reemployment Plan. And lastly, there is a provision in there for the impacting the duration of benefits. It's capped at 8 weeks. So even if they are, the temporarily unemployed status extends beyond that range, their benefits are limited to 8 weeks. You'll have another piece of paper behind that memo. It'll include the language itself for reference. So with that, happy to answer questions. Would also turn the mic over to the next folks on the agenda.
Any questions? Mr. Hayes.
I'm not sure if this question will be for you or maybe Secretary Schultz. Going back to the provisions of expanding from the work search requirement from 8 weeks up to the 6 months, was additional benefits drawn after 8 weeks for those employees that were considered temporary unemployment claimants?
I think for a more specific answer, I would defer to Secretary Schultz on this.
Yeah, so he's here just to kind of explain what the motion was and what it did entail. But Secretary Schultz, would you be able to answer that?
Yeah, yes, thank you. I can answer that. It would be possible that if somebody were temporarily unemployed for, say, 2 or 3 weeks, came back to, like, came off and on, that expanded over that 6 months. Indeed, that certainly could have been possible. I do have our unemployment director, Troy Bell, here with any specifics. I don't think we would have the numbers available right now, but we could get back to you on that.
Okay, well, Mr. Hayes, you have another question?
Yeah, this would probably still come back to Secretary Schultz. Under the provisions on the front page of the KLRD handout, the top sub-bullet is be covered by a collective bargaining agreement. Is there concerns from a uniformity standpoint with US DOL versus just state unemployment parameters?
Sure, that's a great question and a great call out. That's one of the things that we are not required to do, but as a best practice is to run any new legislation through USDOL. And so we did run these provisions through USDOL when it was passed last year, and they did not have any issues with conformity regarding collective bargaining.
Mr. Oswald.
Thank you, Chairman. Secretary, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like to me that the purpose of this is to create a work search waiver type of situation. Is that kind of way I'm understanding this, or is there more involved in this?
I would defer to the committee what the purpose of it is. I know Jake and Phil have been working very closely with one another.
Yeah, it wasn't the Department of Labor's request or motion. This came during a conference committee that one of the members brought.
Well, I was, because it's seemingly to me that it's the goal of this is to not have people look for work during the period that they're actively doing their job attached, right? They're still employer attached, but they've been furloughed for some reason. I think there's other statutory opportunities here that other states use that provide similar or same type of situation that may not be as complicated as this, but I don't know. I don't know enough about the history of this to really advise one way or the other.
Yeah, so hold on to that, because when we get to the solutions part of this, we can talk about what other states are doing. If you can weigh in, that'd be great. Mr. Miller.
I was just going to add, because Phil and I have actually talked about this a lot, about how the proviso came about and how it got kind of pushed through at the last second. I can go through some of the specifics and why certain things were included and weren't, and how it actually wasn't even a perfect mesh. But I just saying that because I know that the secretary didn't have much on that, but I'm happy to answer those questions when I'm up, if you'd like.
And you're up next, and I'm not seeing any further questions. So, Mr. Miller.
You want me to go from here up there? Or?
You can, wherever you're most comfortable, you want to do
Sure.
it there.
I like here. Makes me feel more powerful.
Although, I thought you were in Mexico. You don't look like you got a tan at all.
Wasn't long enough. 3 days is not long enough. So I'll start with the proviso piece. So And to give a little background on this, specifically to Mr. Oswald's question, General Motors was temporarily laying off their plant in downtown Kansas City, Kansas, to bring in the new Equinox and the new Equinox EV. As we saw, there was a big rollout, couple $1 billion in investment that were going to KCK and also some of the other states for this retooling of the plant, and they were going to have to do it. Well, in the following of that, we realized there was a kind of an issue within temporary UI, in that temporary UI called for a return to work date within 8 weeks. There were caveats in there for certain people who had weather-related jobs and other issues, or were part of hiring hall unions for building and trades, but there wasn't for kind of manufacturing jobs. And so we went early on, and I had conversations with Chairman Tarwater early on regarding how to handle a situation like this and what to look at. And in fact, John Federico in the back, who's the lobbyist for GM, was working with us from prior to session last year as well, trying to get something handled on this. As we were working through it, we were trying to find a way to essentially eliminate the work search piece, to Mr. Oswald's point, right? Because all of these people qualified for unemployment under temp UI. There was nothing that says they could not qualify for unemployment in Kansas. The difference was we had a lot of people getting rejected because when they would get asked the question if they were employed, they say yes, because they were still employed. Or quite frankly, they didn't want to go apply for a job. And conversations I had with many people was, you don't want, I think the total number was like 2,300 workers applying for a bunch of jobs, HR having to give them interviews, and then they don't accept the job because they've got a better job here 6 months from now. So the idea was to try to get around the work search piece. This was kind of a slow moving process. We were working with some people from GM and some other folks in trying to do this, but one of the other things we were trying to do was make it overarching to include folks like Panasonic, Spirit Aerosystems, Goodyear and Topeka, some of these other major manufacturing plants that may see these things. This is something that's not going to happen every year, but may happen once every 2 years for one of these large scale manufacturers, especially in today's world where our technology is increasing. They shut down the plant for 2 months or 3 months so they can up and increase the technology and expect everyone to come back. Well, the issue was, if all these people go and apply for jobs or even accept a job in the meantime, what if they get hurt and then they go back to work when GM's ready and they're now hurt? They can't go back, so GM's not ready, can't use them. Or on the flip side, what if they take a job and GM spends all this money? Now they don't have a workforce to start working, and that's true for everyone. So I will tell you, I sent an email when we were working with GM that came with a couple options on how we handle this. And really the options were supposed to be put together. So I had my second child in May of this year. So I was on paternity leave. And when that email got sent, the people up here that my people that were talking to took that as option 1 or 2 and not really realizing that they were supposed to be meddled together. So the proviso is not perfect and is not clear. And it got us through for this year, but it was not something we ever planned on being the actual language of a bill. It was simply to try to waive the work search piece, which I don't know that it fully did anyways. But again, all of these people would have been eligible for unemployment. It was simply the work search piece that we were trying to get waived. So I don't know if there's questions specifically about the proviso or if you want me to kind of detail where we went through after that. I just wanted to clean up because I know there's questions on the proviso and thinking the proviso is the starting point. It really was never meant to be the starting point. I'll tell you, like, one reason collective bargaining agreements was put in, that was not even something we put in. That was something from the management side that was put in early on from the proviso point, because their point was, well, maybe that'll make the legislature or the Department of Labor feel more secure that these people actually have a good job when they return, because it's harder to terminate someone who's under a collective bargaining agreement than who's an at-will employee. So that was the belief of why I believe they put that in, to think it would help. But as we came across and my conversations with Phil, we both, at brought up the point that that would raise issues long-term. So that's something we wouldn't want to see long-term. But I think that's why that was originally included. But if there's no questions on the proviso piece, I can actually dive into the other aspects.
Why don't you go ahead and go forward and we'll go from there.
So after the proviso met, the governor's office reached out to us all and asked for us to kind of build a working group to look at this scenario because I think we did realize that there was a larger issue here that needed to be solved for when these come up. One of the first conversations Phil and I had was, as much as we love working together, we don't want to work together on unemployment every year. So let's figure out how to solve this so we don't have to do it every year. And so I think the package that was brought and agreed to is a good one. And I think is one that makes sense. So we had multiple working groups with Department of Labor, as well as a whole management committee. I think you all had about 8 individuals and we had about 8 from labor. And then in the interim of those meetings, me, Phil, and either Department of Labor or Connor from the governor's office were still working together to get to these aspects. And essentially what we came to was try to find the cleanest way to waive the work search requirement for those who are on temporary unemployment. Now, from a management perspective, there's obviously other scenarios they would want for other businesses and aspects to not have to be on the hook for someone who's doing a temporary layoff, and I totally understand that. So that's why those weren't necessarily crafted at the beginning, but have been since kind of included. One of the papers that was handed out to you all is a paper that kind of was an overview of what we came up with. And so when you look at this number 1 on expand temporary unemployment, I don't know that I love the word of expand temporary unemployment, but it in essence does. Essentially what we did is we went in and we deleted within 8 weeks within the temporary UI statute. The temporary UI statute said you had to have a return to work date within 8 weeks, otherwise you essentially weren't temporarily unemployed. So we went and deleted that because at the end of the day, whether someone has a return to work date within 8 weeks or they have a return to work date within 6 months, or even to a conversation that Phil and I had within 52 weeks, essentially the claimant's benefit year, they still are never going to get more than the statutorily allowed unemployment for that time period. Right now is 16 weeks. So even if you make that point 8 weeks or you make that point 52 weeks, they still will never get more than 16 weeks of unemployment. So no one was here trying to get more unemployment or anything like that. It was simply the work search piece. And what we also came to was that there is a want from both sides to solve this because to my point of applying for a lot of jobs and weighing down an HR department for these certain aspects, but also it and the companies who are doing the temporary layoff, they need their people back for this kind of investment. And then also the labor side. We had a lot of people who were running into issues with the work search piece that were older because they were like, well, I don't want to find a new job. I'm 3 years from retirement. I've got a good pension at GM. I don't want to run this risk. So for number 1, the simple fix on that was essentially to remove the within 8 weeks piece. That would also take care of the aspects within my reemployment that would have triggered. Because my reemployment has a provision that says if you are not on temporary unemployment, then you have to do the my reemployment plan. Well, this by removing the within 8 weeks would bring that back into that ability. The second issue is on the supplemental unemployment benefit plans. They call them sub-plans. There's been a lot of confusion around these. And a lot of people believe, well, if I'm getting sup pay, why should I also be getting unemployment pay? That was a big conversation that happened during the conference committee last year in the wee hours of the morning. What we realized and when we did and we dove through this is a sub plan is not actually wages. It's an employee benefit. It's the benefit that the employer is paying these employees for staying off work. And under, I believe it's the US DOL, you can't treat a sub plan pay as wages for unemployment reasons. So you can't reduce the amount of unemployment given to someone who has a sub plan. There are ways and regulations that we can put in place around that. And what we realized is Kansas doesn't have any statutory language around subplans, and that's why it was so new to us and so new to everyone. So I can't take credit. Phil did most of the research for it, but he went and found other states and the language we had in regarding subplans and what passes muster with the U.S. Department of Labor for us to move forward with those subpay plans and how those would work with our unemployment so that they would now be defined in law as well, since we were quite frankly silent on it before. And then the last piece, I'm not going to touch on, I'll let Phil touch on, because as our position has been, it's a piece that deals with rate tables and how employers will pay certain rates and different surcharges. That piece to us doesn't have an impact on the worker and wouldn't really be fair for us to pick a side on. So we're just kind of allowing that there. I totally understand the argument from both sides on it. But it's not a piece that really impacts our folks. I guess one more caveat that's not listed on here that we talked about was a mass upload sheet. So much like the work share program, if a employer is going to go on temporary UI to kind of remove the burden from the worker, but also management, they can do a mass upload of here's the workers that are going to be on temporary UI. Here is where we believe their return to work date is going to be. And then after that, obviously the claimants would have to go in weekly and fill out the information, but that initial step is going to be handled with one spreadsheet to try to get it handled quickly. I don't know if anyone has questions on any of that, but that was kind of the brief overview of that process and how we got there.
Okay, thanks for the overview, and especially the subpay. There's a lot of people that don't understand what that is. On the last piece, can you say that again? You want the employer to be able to just send us the list and have it be automatic?
So this was actually a request from the employer that once I didn't even know it was an option to the worker. Once I understood it, it made a lot more sense. My understanding, it's the same as the work share program, correct? So when there's instead of every claimant going in and filling something out and then it getting noticed to the employer can actually upload a mass spreadsheet of here's the 1,500 people that we're going to put on temporary UI. Here's their return to work date. And then my understanding is it just streamlines everything for the employer, but it would also streamline it for the employee as well.
Madam Secretary, is that something we can handle at this point, or is that something in the future?
Yeah, thank you, Representative. So in the prior system, we did have that. There was discussion about putting this in statute. We as an agency don't believe that it's necessary to put functionality like this in a statute. So we are actually going to be deploying that in a few months.
Okay. I have a few questions, but I'll open it for questions first if anyone else wants to chime in. Mr. Oswald.
I don't know who, thank you, Chairman. I don't know who this is going to be the appropriate question to. I'll present to Mr. Miller and he can pass it off. The obvious question is, if you're going to uncharge employers for weather-related issues, which I know a lot of employers of my clientele who would love that, who determines whether it's a weather-related issue? Is it the state? Is it going to be the employer? What prevents an employer from saying in the middle of summer, hey, I'm running short of funds and it's going to be hot outside, so I'm going to lay off my employees for 2 weeks, and they collect 2 weeks of unemployment and the employer doesn't get charged for it? I mean, I know that's a ridiculous occurrence, but it could happen, obviously.
So Phil could probably answer this better, but I'll do my best to start. So within the My Reemployment Plan, there was a caveat that excluded weather-related businesses from needing to do certain things on the My Reemployment aspect. While changing temporary UI, we felt like that was actually going to solve their problem too of why they need to be excluded. So that's how they got wrapped in. That wasn't something that we threw in at the end. It's something that was already existing in law, and I guess it's defined on the, I'll let Phil finish, but I guess it's defined on the national level.
Mr. Hayes, you want to weigh in on that?
So actually in House Bill 2570 from 2024, we actually created 2 exceptions within the My Reemployment Plan for work search. And they're much more explicit than what's on the handout today. They are related to basically linear contractors, those that are doing asphalt and pavement work, bridge building. And then we also included ready mix plants because you have to have weather at a certain temperature for consecutive days. So we initially, in working with the administration or the department, was do we look at SIC codes or do we do NAICS codes? And ultimately, we left it to define the contextual definition of a couple SIC codes. And so it's a very, very limited, narrow carve out that's not going to be broadly or overly utilized.
And it really hasn't been utilized in the last several years very much at all, because, you know, the global warming thing.
I also forgot to
Mr.
add.
Miller?
Sorry. I also forgot to, and it's separate from that question, but when I was looking at my paper, I forgot to add, there was one more caveat we're going to add, and that's formally defining what is unemployment compensation exhausting of benefits. And the reason for that is a lot of these employers, especially with their sub-pay plans and other things, would say, well, when are your unemployment benefits exhausted? And it was truly, one of the questions was, well, can't this employer deem it as this and this employer deem it as that? And that's to my point that I started with of me and Phil saying we don't want to be here every year. We thought, let's define this stuff so we're not having a remember what we did in 2027 and 2028. So
Yeah, I think that'd be important to do. Are there any other questions? So I have a problem with people being paid to sit at home when the state of Kansas has such a great need for skilled workers. And I understand it if a company wants to pay somebody for that. What I don't understand is utilizing the unemployment system and trust fund that other companies are paying into. And so how do we get around that? How do we, that piece of it where as a result of these layoffs and the 16 weeks versus 8 weeks, every employer in the state of Kansas will pay a higher rate next year. And so how do we get around keeping that from happening? When the intent of unemployment has always been to help somebody in a short period of time get a job as quick as they can. Because it's not a fund to pay people to not look for work. It's a fund to help people find a job and help them get through the day. And I get that GM or any company that has a sub-pay plan will pay their employees, but I don't understand why we have to rely on the unemployment fund also that will drain it for other companies. Can you help us justify that?
So I will tell you, part of your answer is answered through number 3, which I'm saying that Phil will be the one to talk about, because I will not act like I understand rate tables and how employers are taxed, because as a labor representative, that's not in my wheelhouse. I will say that one reason of the exhaustion definition piece that was added was there's a lot of CBAs out there that say once your unemployment is exhausted, you could start getting aspects of this sub-pay plan. Well, the problem was what's the term of exhausted? So what was happening on some of this with the proviso was for 8 weeks, these folks didn't have to look for work, but then from weeks 8 to 16, they were having to look for work. Well, quite frankly, from a labor perspective, if you told them that their unemployment benefits were only limited to 8 weeks because of temporary UI, that would be fine. They're exhausted. They would move into their sub-pay plan and kick in with the rest of it. The problem is we didn't have those definitions in place. So there was this gray area of who's going to determine what that is what's that definition, right? So I think the hard part of answering your question is from a labor perspective. You know, I'm not asking other employers to pay for the employees of other folks. That's not what I'm asking. I'm looking out for my employees to have to meet the thresholds they're supposed to meet to retain their job. And as I've talked with Phil multiple times, and even the GM folks, I totally understand where both of them are coming from these perspectives on rate tables and surcharges. From our perspective, that doesn't impact us. What we want to know is if they're only unemployed temporarily because their employer is usually for these would be a major investment in the state of Kansas for some sort of retooling. And they're asking us to remain their workforce for us to come back. I mean, the workforce at GM has millions of dollars invested in those individuals being the ones who return to go back to building those cars. And so there's a want from GM to keep those employers, just like if it was Panasonic or someone else. So my job is to sit there and make sure that these employees are meeting those requirements they have to meet. So I don't know that I can really answer your question of how to make, why it's fair or unfair. I totally get your point, but it's also for the reasons I gave earlier on of why, GM doesn't want someone to go take a job at UPS temporarily and then break their leg and then they can't come back to work when they're needed after they just did this investment, right? Same thing with Panasonic, same thing with Spirit and these other places. So I think our idea was to try to outline what temporary unemployment is for these subpay plans. And one of the initial conversations was the belief was going to be that subpay plans really reduce the amount of unemployment a claimant could receive. Well, when we dove in, we did some research, we realized that's really not legally able to be done. The U.S. Department of Labor doesn't allow that to be done. So at the end of the day, these folks are unemployed. And so they're going to meet the requirements for unemployment, whether they have a subpay plan or not. It's the question of work search. And so when it comes to that the truth is 99% of the people who are sitting there meeting that requirement for work search that's from one of these mass layoffs, that's a temporary unemployed layoff, are going to be applying for jobs they do not plan to accept, weighing down the system and weighing down other applicants who really truly do need a job. So I think the way to do that, is your point, is how do we even that out for the other businesses? But I don't know that it's really on the employee to figure that out.
Yeah, so that's the crux of the whole thing is in real world unemployment, if you apply for a job and get hired and don't accept it, you no longer qualify for unemployment because we've done our job. We've asked you to go look for work, you look for work, you got a job, you didn't accept it, that's on you. That's how it works in the real world. This class of worker, it doesn't. And that's what I have a hard time understanding. And let me just say right off that, and I'm sure Phil and I have talked about this, this is not a GM issue. This is a worker issue and a state law versus US law issue. And we all appreciate the billions of dollars of investment that GM does in the state of Kansas and the jobs they provide. And I certainly agree that if and they're all about their employees too. They want this to work for them, and that's why they're at the table trying to make it work. They're okay. I mean, if we could find a way, if we could define exhaustion in 8 weeks, they'd be good with that. They just want their employees to be able to get their sub pay so that they can keep them. You're right. And so, if there's somebody here that can comment on that with the Kansas DOL, can we define exhaustion of benefits on temporary employees after 8 weeks?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So if I could, I'd like to call up our our Deputy Chief Legal, Todd Thornburg, and he can probably answer that question for you.
All right, I think Mr. Hayes has a comment after that. So. All right. Thank you, sir. If you could just make sure the microphone's on and then state your name and Okay, well, so much for that idea. You got anything else, Mr. Miller?
No, and that was something we ran into and why that idea kind of did get shut down. I will say that truly between the Department of Labor, the labor side, the management side, we tried to think of all these alternatives. We tried to think of all these avenues, and to comply with the law and not make something that picked winners and losers or anything like that. We came up with what we came up with because it was what complied with the law, and didn't stop. So.
Mr. Hayes?
Yeah, just to kind of echo a couple of things and reinforce a few components. What brought the temporary work group together was, where's the solution that we can get past the 8 weeks? And this is not a quick direct line. Supplemental unemployment benefit plans govern that a claimant's benefits have to be fully exhausted. And in Kansas, depending on the state of our economy, whether it's 16, 20, or 26 weeks, that governs that, because each claimant will establish a benefit year amount that gets divided by the 16, 20, or 26 weeks, and that payout comes down. And so if we cut them off on the 8 weeks, and this comes back to an earlier piece, is lifting the work search requirement within 8 weeks for the subpay plan payments to go out. They still have to receive up to the 16 weeks of benefits in Kansas. So not only did we just lift the nuance of the language for the 8 weeks, we actually moved the needle and created more of a draw against the trust fund, because sub-plan payments are predicated that state unemployment benefits get paid out and exhausted. So that 8-week proviso stretched that out to 16 weeks and created much more strain on the fund as a whole. And so that's the wrinkle, is you can't just simply move one without impacting the other, which causes subsidization for every other employer that is rated within our system. And so the business community is coming to the table in earnest to find a solution, and we're going to talk about some solutions next as we progress into here. There's just not a super easy clean that's going to make everybody happy. So.
Okay, thanks for that. Any other questions or comments? Thanks for coming home from Mexico just for this.
No, I was scheduled to come home yesterday. Don't worry.
And it's my understanding you might have to leave us early today too.
Yes, I'm in the middle of some union negotiations in Lawrence, so our next one's at 3:00, so I'm gonna have to leave here in a little bit, but.
Okay, well, thanks for taking the time to come up here and help explain this, and we'll keep you in the loop as we move forward with different solutions. But just so we're clear, labor is okay with 8 weeks of benefits if we can find a way to do that, because they're going to get their sub pay.
And I can't speak for all of labor. From the GM, from UAW Local 31 perspective, that would have been fine to solve theirs. One issue we ran into and one thing we were trying to future-proof was all of these CBAs are different. So there was a caveat that was brought up by, I think it was Goodyear and Topeka. I don't represent them, so I don't know what their CBA specifically says. But they had, and I think that was the 16-week one that got brought up to us. There's a lot of different, these CBAs, a lot of them are even national, and they try to comply with as many states as they can. So it would solve it for some, but I don't know that it would solve it for all. But it's, from the perspective of why this started, it would. But for the others, I don't know that it would solve everyone's. And so that was why we started the conversation of what does the term unemployment benefit exhaustion mean? Because a lot of these CBAs say once your unemployment benefits are exhausted. So the question was, well, okay, is the temp UI exhausted? Is the non-temp UI, what is defined as exhausted? Because it doesn't really define that in statute.
Okay. Well, you don't represent them yet, but maybe you will after today.
Oh, maybe.
All right. Anything else before you go? All right, so thanks for that. And next up, we'll have Mr. Hayes, Phil Hayes. I believe there's a slide presentation. there you go. Got it. Perfect.
Okay. Mr. Oswald teased me before the meeting started, and he seen the agenda and said, Phil, are you really going to speak about temporary unemployment for 3 hours? I can assure you I'm not. I'm going to try to run through this in about 45 minutes, allow for some Q&A, and still see if we can find an early exit today. So bear with me, but I will take questions as we move along. So I also want to just draw attention. I talk about the Kansas Business Coalition. This is kind of an informal group that has been involved in Kansas UI reform for the past 15 plus years. Kansas SHRM has kind of been the initial platform that I stood on, but NFIB has been a critical partner at the Kansas Chamber, the Kansas Contractors Association. As we talked about the weather-related exceptions, they were instrumental in the conversation a couple of years back. And the Kansas Restaurant and Hospitality Association, because essentially they were the largest group or industry that subsidized the old arrayed system and some of the misfortunes under the old Kansas law. So definitely been helpful to have them on the team. So what I'm going to hit on just briefly is we're going to hit on a few building blocks for the what I would consider the people that don't really speak the detailed UI lingo. Talk about some of the historical reforms and impacts and why they're important for the conversation as we move forward today. Look at the budget proviso implications, the activity that's occurred since then from the business community, as well as the governor's work group and the broader business coalition looking at considerations and recommendations. So I hope to leave this presentation and the conversation with some solutions that we feel address a lot of these issues. So moving into the UI financing and solvency basis or basics, every state system has some sort of an experience rating. Ours was watered down for a number of years until 2013 when we got into the legislative process to reform this and switched Kansas from an arrayed system to a fixed financing system. But we had a fixed taxable wage base from 1983 until 2000, I believe, 13, where it was stuck at $8,000, and that really worked against the components of it. Kansas now has an indexed wage base. We're one of 18 states. This gives states that operate in this manner the broadest taxable wage base and the most stable financing. Every state system is different. It's interesting. Different legislators or different states or businesses from an eco-devo standpoint will look at a UI system, but there's no two animals that look alike in this instance because there's 53 states or territories that have their own laboratories and how they approach this. But the wage bases are determined largely on a number of things. But I will say that the complementary tool to the wage base is your actual maximum tax rate that is issued to employers. So we see ranges from 0 to 20% across the nation. And again, the wage base, the federal wage base is $7,000. If that was indexed for inflation, it would be north of $55,000. That gives you some context of what Kansas's $8,000 fixed wage base for 30 years and the implications there. As Secretary Schultz mentioned, beginning in 2026, we're now indexed to the state average annual wage at 25% for 26 and 27, as these are our first 2 years that we're indexing. This year we went up from 14,000 to a little over 15,000, and you can see that in 28 through 2030, we're going to progress up to a 40% taxable wage base. That's going to help alleviate some of the subsidization and the pressure for what I would consider employers that do not have a lot of claimant or a lot of draw against the funds. I will remind you too that in 2031, and this will become paramount as we go a little bit further, there's opportunity that our wage base could go up to 45% if we end up in the tax tables, in the solvency tables for 5 consecutive years. So 40% was the agreed upon threshold, working with the financial analysts with DOL years back, that we felt like that was kind of the tipping point or the balancing point with Kansas employer and historical usage. So the experience rated systems, again, the maximum rate is going to put a cap on the amount of dollars that can be limited by any employer that's in the max rated tables. The minimum rates, again, dictate the minimum, obviously. So there's obviously some situations where a pooled trust fund or a pooled system makes sense. If you look at the bottom bullet or the top bullet in this bottom grouping, if an employer goes out of business, that becomes a shared cost across the board. Every employer in the fund, in the system, helps cover that. But administering unchecked and bad regulations or a proviso trying to address one particular situation essentially causes bad policy and unintended consequences. And we're going to dive into those a little bit more. So again, we are in a pooled situation. My good friend Eric Stafford from the Kansas Chamber has said for years, think about this as car insurance. If you have more car accidents, you're likely going to pay a higher premium than your neighbor. If you have less accidents, your premium should be lower. So if we look at just general concerns as a whole, prior to 2024, actually 2024, I felt like we put the kind of the last bookend in place dealing with the good guardrails, framing in temporary unemployment, benefit exhaustion, everything that we've talked about, and giving a path forward for predictability. Unfortunately, with that budget proviso, more than 60,000 positive rated employers are going to experience an avoidable increase in taxes. So again, the subsidization is back that we felt like we actually framed in and gave good rules of the road. This is probably, this graphic summarizes the work that's been done since 2010. The big heavy years, the heavier lifts are outlined toward the bottom here. You can see the flags that are in the coffin here, those that are in red, these are elements now that are related to the proviso conversation that we're going to end up discussing and addressing again. So my goal is in the 2026 session is I wish we could have come to a full agreement out of the Kansas work group from the governor's office, but we need to identify a long-term sustainable solution that is going to be responsive to today's economy and be nimble for employers as well as the workforce and employees in Kansas. So my goal, again, is see if we can put the final nail in the coffin, raise the final flag on this as we move forward. People often ask me, why do you care so much, or how did you get involved with this? And the Arnold Group, we're a staffing and recruiting firm. Unemployment is a big component for us. And in the mid-2000s, after the 9/11 recession, our contributions ranged significantly. And I didn't understand why there was so much fluctuation. 2005, I actually started digging into the statutes and then began tracking our data from 2007 forward. What I want to highlight in the first 3 years, 2007 to 2009, on the right column, our 3-year average taxable payroll was about 6.7 million. Our state average contributions to unemployment was about 56,000. The next subsequent years coming out of the Great Recession, because we had bad policy and bad laws in place, our average payroll actually decreased, but our contributions increased more than 700%. We were paying roughly $458,000 a year with next to no notice. That becomes difficult for any business to overcome, and that was going on across the board. More than 85% of businesses across Kansas felt this same pain because our wage base was so low and we could only get a finite amount from those that overuse the system versus their contributions. So all the pressure got funneled upward, and that's why the bulk of all positive rated employers got maxed out and still paid the maximum state rate under the old system. 2015 through 2016 is when we changed from the arrayed system to the fixed system of financing methodology. You can see our 3-year average taxable payroll nearly doubled, but our our contributions were cut down to next to nothing, a little under $11,000 for the last 10 years on an annual average. The FUTA comparison on the right, because that's been a stable component, gives you a little bit more comparison. But I just want you to reflect on that 711% increase overnight. That was difficult to maintain and budget through and find our footing to maintain to ensure that we stayed in business. I am happy to report, because we've done a lot of good work, and this will make sense, I promise, just bear with me as we go through. From state fiscal year 2015 in the light orange, in that year we had a little over 50,000 positive rated employers and a little under 6,000 negative rated employers. You can look at the taxable wage-based dollars, whole dollars or percentages. Fast forward 10 years to the blue side, you can see we've grown Kansas employers to positive rated to a little over 61,000. We've decreased negative by 22 or at 2,200. You can see the number change in the green summary in the lower right. We have done tremendous work to give predictability and stability to the employer community and protect a good benefit for claimants when the need arises. Secretary Schultz mentioned earlier, we have about 81,000 rated employers currently. There's nuances between inactive accounts and terminated accounts. So when you look at the math, I want to say we're close. What is that? All the blue numbers in the upper left, the 61, the 18, and the 22 is right at that 81,000 mark, because these are essentially those that are active in the system. So a lot of good work to a lot of members and legislators and colleagues, and ultimately the Kansas Business Coalition that I've worked with for the years to improve our position so significantly. This next slide shows at the beginning of each year, the U.S. Department of Labor highlights trust fund solvency, and Secretary Schultz mentioned this earlier, but to give you an acute focus on it, Kansas has the 6th most solvent trust fund in the nation. Our variable is a 1.71, so if we keep that in mind, that becomes important here in a bit. There's still a couple of states that are actually upside down in borrowing, but there's still a host of states that are under the solvency threshold, and if and when a recession hits, they're going to be back into a borrowing situation. So the next component here is it translates to how much does it actually cost employers to pay into the fund. So average employer cost tax amount per covered employee per year. Kansas is paying, this is as of calendar year 2023. This has not been published. I checked this morning. It's not been updated, but 2 years ago, we were at $193 per employee per year. The US national average is $280. We're 31% under the average. We're 37th or 17th best in the nation as of 2 years ago. And I strongly believe we've actually improved this position over the last 2 years. So I'm excited to see where that goes. Secretary Schultz mentioned our trust fund is currently at like $1.5 billion. So the question always comes up, why should we care? Our fund is flush. Why do we care about having a high balance? Why are we nitpicking on the 8 weeks versus 16 weeks? At the end of the day, it's a tax, it's a cost of doing business. But I also think there's a benefit and a residual annuity effect that the state of Kansas and ultimately every employer in Kansas, positive and negative rated employers, benefit from. In 2025, Kansas received $51.8 million in interest from the feds. So our high trust fund balance serves in that capacity. That almost $52 million is covering about 19 weeks of unemployment benefits in the state. That relieves pressure off of employers across the state. That allows us to stay in the tax credit tables. Tax Foundation issues a tax competitive index every single year. Kansas has never really been in the top 10 over the last 5 years. We've actually broke the top 10 in the unemployment tax ranking. We're number 4 in the newest rating. I'm hopeful that we can maintain this position and stay close to a podium position, that as we work on property tax or income tax reductions, et cetera, we improve Kansas's overall position, and we could actually crack the top 20, maybe the top 10 in subsequent years. But we have a real opportunity to misstep and lose our best component if we don't get this right in the 26th session. Going back to 2024 in House Bill 2570, we also introduced a negative debt write-off provision for employers that were severely upside down. They had a lot of legacy debt that was largely uncollectible because our system for 50 years was an arrayed system, and it just worked against this. So this provided them an opportunity to pretty much get to the line, get to the next ladder rung that they could start climbing the tax rate schedules. We had more than 1,700 employers participate. We wrote off more than $405 million in bad debt in the unemployment trust fund. So we did this to provide equal footing because we shored up some new guardrails. We wanted to level the playing field and allow every employer to control their own UI tax destiny. Unfortunately, what happened in 25,
Sorry, sorry to interrupt you, but I want to stop you right there. If you recall, when we passed that 2570 and got rid of all the negative balances, I wouldn't call it bad debt, I'd call it negative balances in their funds. We had to do it, and we had to do it like every year, every 2 or 3 years in order for conformity issues for the DOL, with the intent that we would come back in 26 and stop forgiving the bad debt loophole every single year or every 3 years so that people can self-manage their funds. And so there was a bill coming either way this year to undo that so that we don't have to go back and put their negative debt back, but we can go back and stop forgiving the loophole. And so just wanted to make that quick note. Mr. Hayes.
thank you. Yeah, and to that point, we couldn't do just a one-time and sunset it. For conformity, it had to be a longer-term solution. And the conversation is maybe we come back and revisit that. And I think the reasoning behind that still suffices today. So when we look at what happened in 25, again, it's a pooled trust fund benefit payments, regardless of which employers workers receive them. It affects the overall solvency of the fund, which ultimately determines the tax schedules that we apply to all employers. Again, as I alluded to, Kansas has strengthened our financing structure and modernized our technology platform. However, we had a temporary budget proviso granted. It extended not only the callback component, but it really extended an additional 8 weeks of benefits. And so the instance that came up, it surrounded a supplemental unemployment benefit plan employer. There's very few of those in any state. However, they do exist. Sub-plans originated in the 1950s, really as a severance tool for employers that would put somebody on, allow them to get unemployment, and you get your sub-pay on top of it. And there's a natural governing factor that claimant is going to want to go find a job before their unemployment benefits fall off. So if they did, then the sub-plan payments also stopped early. And so it was a way to mitigate and reduce some of that severance payout. Since the mid-50s, it's been applied to temporary unemployment, and Kansas is not unique in this stance. It's just that I think we've caught on the impact and how it is impacting the fund and the tax schedules for everybody else. So when we look at the impacts in 2026, actually in 25, we were under tax schedule B, and we're going to move to tax schedule C in 2026. We're going to talk about the implications of why that matters as we move here in just a bit. But sub-plans, we're going to talk about them just to give a better understanding and build a foundation for everybody. These are employer-sponsored programs. They provide additional income or supplemental during periods of layoff or reduced work hours. Employees must be eligible and receive state unemployment insurance benefits first before they receive the supplement. So again, this does not replace, it only supplements and stacks on top of those. So definitely some interplay here that we want to look at. There's a tremendous amount of benefits of sub-plans. For employees, it gives them additional income security, may reduce financial hardship during those layoffs, ensures stronger ties to the employer, easing recall and reemployment, which we heard about a little bit ago. For employers, it helps maintain that workforce attachment with the loyalty and morale, reduces their overall turnover costs and retraining, demonstrates commitment to the employees, and it strengthens that labor relation aspect. For states, these are obviously employer funded, but they do still stack on top of the state benefits. Reduces pressure on other public assistance programs, so certainly a benefit. Supports community industries where temporary shutdowns are cyclical. So the cons of them, though, for employees, there's a dependence on recalls that may discourage job active search, especially with long recall dates. The interplay with my reemployment plan that we've talked about. Benefits are unevenly available. Typically, these are only provided by larger employers. Workers still may face a gap if their UI benefits expire before the recall occurs, or if subsequently they're let go indefinitely rather than just temporarily after a period of time. Employers require significant financial and administrative commitment to set these up. It's still likely going to increase their tax cost as well because they're in a system as all rated employers are. But here's where kind of the crux of it is too. It attracts additional scrutiny as it shifts costs onto state UI funds, and that employer is the only one that is supplementing and benefiting in essence from that arrangement. So states still bear the full burden. Employees must first claim the UI benefits, so on and so forth. When we look at the policy tension, and that's really where kind of the arm wrestling has been over the summer here, is the eligibility versus reemployment piece to what Chairman was speaking of earlier. Subplans comply with UI eligibility rules. Workers are unemployed if they're not receiving wages. And this is the IRS language in the subplan guidelines issued by USDOL is these wages or the dollars, the remuneration is classified as benefits and not wages. And so that's the loophole to some degree in that respect. So the employer versus public cost sharing is a big component, which is ultimately what started me on my journey 20 years ago on UI reform. Employers fund their subtrust, but states and their employers still fund the UI-based benefits, leading to the debate about the equitability piece of it and the cost split. So the short-term versus long-term shutdowns, we framed in the 8-week temporary unemployment unless you're weather related. Really thinking about a long, cold, hard winter in Kansas versus a management function or a business cycle. Every business has business cycles, and most of the businesses in Kansas do not have necessarily this option. Most of them aren't even aware that these plans exist. In summary, subplans strike a balance between worker income security, employer workforce stability, but they also introduce trust fund strain and policy equity challenges. So I would just like to remind policymakers as we move forward, I think we should be much more clear on setting limits, or at least adhering to the limits that we did set. Talk about the eligibility and wage search work piece, evaluating the fairness of those relative to other industries, monitoring trust fund solvency. This is the biggest piece because the tax schedule shift, we're going to have $10 million tax increase for 60,000 employers in Kansas that had no relation to this event. And so that burden, that subsidization got shifted upward because of the tax schedule shift. So in earnest in the conversations over the summer, we looked at all states who has indexed wage bases, who has alternative taxable wage bases or a surcharge range, just trying to draw some comparisons. There's other states that have a 2% solvency surcharge within indicated states that we looked at specifically dealing with upside down debt as we go forward. So I want to kind of break down how the interplay between subpayments and the unemployment benefits work as clearly as I can. And so the language or the flyer that Jake went over was kind of an early discussion document that we had, and we actually had a much more bolstered document within the work group over the summer. But the language that, or the information that KDOL provided was looking at the surcharge impact or implications using the standard rate group. And so in the top grouping here, you'll see this is kind of grayed out a little bit because yes, this is our standard rate group G, but we were actually in tax group or tax schedule B last year. So instead of at an 8.35% for the most upside down negative rated employer, they were operating at a 6.65% because conformity and uniformity guidelines from USDOL said when we created our new tax structure, we couldn't not give the tax credits to negative rated employers too. So by default, they got the benefit and the design of that as well. And you'll see under the 2, 3, or 4% surcharge components, after the percentage is the dollar impact per employee. And then the second column after the percentage. So in this instance, If we did a 4% surcharge in 2026, the standard contribution would be $1,004 for an N11 rated employer. We did a 4%, we'd stack another 604, it'd be $1,600 per employee per year. How subpay works is, if I'm going to use 2026 as an example, if an employee requires state unemployment, the 655, we put that in the first position. Then the subplan target, regardless of the language, whatever that target is, they're going to find the gap between the 655 and, in this instance, a 1303 target. The weekly sub amount would be $648. There's also a tax advantage there because there's tax savings, because now these are no longer considered wages, they're considered benefits. So that employer is also not paying FUTA, SUTA, Social Security, Medicare, et cetera. And so it's a great, great benefit. And so when we look at the impact on one employee, and we'll just stay in the middle table here, in 2026, one employee with no surcharge, the green up top, there's a deficit on 8 weeks that we put strain on the trust fund of over $4,000. By extending this to 16 weeks to the proviso, we went upside down more than $9,100 per employee in this past year. If we look at this 4% surcharge, we would, instead of being upside down 11.6 million or 11,600, we'd be in 11,000 over 20 weeks. So you can see it's a small difference. It's negated to some degree, but the solution that we talked about over the summer was a surcharge component with a 3-year window. So essentially we get a little bit of a layaway plan or a layaway effect over the subsequent 3 years after a triggering event. What I want to magnify here is over the course of 1,400 employees, if we draw here in the middle, the most in 2026 that this employer would contribute would be $1.4 million on these 1,400 employees. We're going to pay out in 8 weeks a little over $7 million. There's a $5.6 million strain on the trust fund. If we go to 16 weeks, that 5.6 balloons up to 12 plus million. In a lesser economy, if we pay out 26 weeks, it's almost a $22 million gap that exists. So what we talked about and where we couldn't get final consensus and agreement on slide 26 here is if we had a triggering year in the middle grouping here, triggering year in 2026 per employee, actually I'm going to go to the 1,400 group just because when you talk about sizable numbers, we collect 2.2 million in contributions, we're upside down 2.5 million after 8 weeks, or we're upside down 9.7 after 16 weeks because the contributions stay the same. If we get into a lesser economy with a surcharge, instead of being 22.5 million at the 26 weeks, we could be 18.5 million stress on the fund. That's on the triggering year. So what we talked about was out year 1, 2, 3, and 4, and really out year 1, 2, and 3, you'll see down here is where we segment out the 868,000 or the 1.07 million or the 1.3 million. Those are the surcharge dollars, the additional dollars that we would collect. So it minimizes the strain, but we're still upside down and there's a significant gap. And when I talk about the layaway mentality, and it wouldn't even necessarily be a sub-pay employer, this could be anybody, is you have a triggering event, we're gonna take care of your workers, we're gonna cover them. However, we're gonna put you on a layaway plan and we're gonna get, after a 16-week, we'll get 33% of that deficit back. Or after 26 weeks, there'd be roughly a 17.5% additional ask over 3 years, not 711% over a 6-year stint. And so having lived through some of those tough years, I feel like this is a predictable plan. It's an acceptable trade-off when you think about if we're gonna move the needle off of 8 weeks, there's gotta be some additional skin in the game to look at this because the $10 million impact that it's gonna have on the bulk of our businesses here in Kansas. We're gonna end up carrying this water. And it may not just be for 1 year. We may stay in this tax schedule another year, or we may actually slide up to Schedule C. or D, as we move forward. So I did talk immediately after the proviso was passed. The business coalition got together. We continued our conversations. Ultimately, we're trying to identify a long-term strategic universal fix that we could actually put this to bed once and for all. We considered multiple options. I've lost count. I engaged with some national experts. I talked to some other counterparts and talked to KDUL, talked to other contacts that I've met through the last couple of decades. But our biggest challenge is the conformity guidelines that USDOL puts on any state agency here. And so our lane that we have to carve this out is extremely narrow. And one conversation, and I pass this up to the UWC group, is has any other state looked at an offset to, and you can't do that because subplan payments are not wages, they're benefits. So you can't offset a benefit amount. We looked at a demand transfer, but there's a risk with that because we're still subsidizing it, and the political winds will shift through the years, and the budget solvency of the state general fund may not always be in a position to provide relief in these instances. So I don't know that there's a great solution other than looking at some sort of a surcharge component. So when we met with the governor's office, our focus again was on the temporary unemployment in the 8 weeks and moving that needle. There's a lot of stakeholders. I think the early meetings, we were pushing 40 people. We dwindled down to about 20 active participants through all the meetings between August and December. We had multiple sub-meetings, but at the end of the day, the business community presented a package deal, labor's neutral on the surcharge piece, and as Jake mentioned, GM couldn't agree to the surcharge proposal piece. So we actually drafted language around the 6 tenets that we pushed forward. At the end of the day, it was 6 reforms for one goal: a more clear, fair, and sustainable UI system that balances flexibility, predictability, but ultimately accountability. So the 5 primary tenets are the expanded unemployment benefits, adding new or clarifying new definitions, so looking at that exhaustion piece, introducing sub-plan language within Kansas statute, so there's an awareness, there's an education component for other employers that potentially may want to look at it, but it also gives us a rule book on how these are applied and how they're interpreted. Moving the temporary UI extensions for weather-related employers to exemptions under new language, and then looking at that new surcharge provision component. So the last piece we actually brought to the table was that mass temporary layoff spreadsheet. And we're happy that KDUL is taking this on, and rightly so. It probably doesn't deserve to be in statute. So I know the broader employer community is extremely pleased that this is going to be dropping soon. So we just felt like these 6 reforms were forward-looking. It gave a framework to balance that fairness, accountability, and trust fund solvency. Still allowed that we're going to take some pressure in the fund, but we're going to mitigate it to some degree. And it provides vital protections for both employees as well as employers. So as we move into this new session, the guardrails that we have to look at is still preserving the experience rating integrity. We just got awarded an integrity award a few years ago. It'd be a little bit silly that we step back from that. Next is reviewing or requiring a fiscal impact review if and when exceptions do get made, because this was a $10 million impact. And then we do have a modern system, and this is going to be continually evolving. We should leverage that system to help us make informed decisions. We should be able to scenario plan and analyze this. So for the business and the legislative takeaway from me, I'll say that everything that we've done up to 2024, the UI system in Kansas was working as it was designed to. It was structured to balance worker support with experience-rated employer financing. However, these temporary exceptions do cause unintentional cost shift. And we certainly want to be mindful of that. So I just want to understand or be sure that we all understand how a solvency-based trigger operates, and that it is an essential component. So predictability, uniformity, stability, all of that is critical for businesses to grow in Kansas. So I look at this that we really have 2 options. Number one, option A, we can do the status quo. We don't change anything. Unfortunately, though, that would leave important and necessary guardrails off to allow this situation to occur again. It would preserve the opportunity to repeat avoidable across-the-board tax increases in future years and risk additional subsidization for an unnamed time frame. Option B was the solution that we ironed out over the last 4 months in the work task group, removing the 8 weeks for anybody that's temporary unemployed, tying the surcharge framework to those higher impact employers, addressing only N9 through N11. And why we did that is anybody else that's in a higher rate group, they have the ability to slide down into a higher tax rate. But if you're in the bottom 3 rate groups, there's nowhere else left to go, and you're going to create that larger imbalance, and it's going to continue to grow. So that's why there was a focus on only the bottom 3 groups. We looked at 3 options. We tied these to severity, and we tied it to a 2-year look-back period. So it wasn't just the severity of a single year. We also tapered that off with a 2-year look-back. Really just trying to be mindful and considerate to try to find a workable solution. Employers can still use voluntary contributions. We still have the seasonal protections. Why this matters, I think we've kind of hammered that home throughout the meeting today. We felt like this provided a limited, specific mechanism to better align contributions with demonstrated system costs. So helps us maintain better trust fund solvency, overall tax competitiveness, and flexibility for employers. So that's where we concluded. Because we didn't get to full consensus, I've continued to beat the drum and work with my counterparts in trying to identify, is there another broader implication or consideration that we could look at? And it kind of led me back to where we didn't necessarily want to extend the tax relief or the tax credits for negative rateds. We shouldn't have reversed our methodology back then. We should have continued to press because they, so I'm going to illustrate that here in just a minute. So I would make the argument that another broader, deeper consideration would be to adjust the negative rated rate groups. And so if you look at this, and I apologize for I get chastised on this, they call this fill font. Anybody that knows me, it's extremely small, but the rate group, positive rate groups are green, the negative rate groups, the bottom 11 are in red there. What I want to illustrate here is the rate group increment. So we introduced a 0 rate group, which helped our tax competitiveness tremendously. And that provided relief for about 500 employers in Kansas that no longer pay even the littlest amount because they're so heavy on their contributions and no usage. But we started at 5 100ths in groupings of 4, so 10, 15, 0.2, 0.25, 0.3. Once we got to the tipping point between positive and negative, where we ended at 0.35, we started reversing back down to 0.3, 0.25, and 0.2. And we did that intentionally because we wanted to keep our max tax rate to a relative decent amount for our tax competitive position. However, we ran a couple of different scenarios. We looked at doubling the rate groups for the negatives, which doesn't help because if we're dealing with a 2% solvency adjustment, that 2% gets weighted out over 39 current groups. If you add 11 more, we're at 50. 2% divided by 50 is going to cause a tax increase for all positive rated. We looked at adding 20 rate groups. None of those really made sense for the issue of the day. So we said, what if we don't add any groups, keep the tables as they are, but just reverse that reduction? Once we come down the mountainside, we're going to keep climbing, and this is ultimately the top of the mountain. So we would go from 0.35 to 0.4, 0.45, and 0.5. We end up at a 10.45. This may be an alternative to the surcharge component, because if you think about our standard rate of 8.35 plus a 4%, you're at 12.3. This standard rate would be 10.45. The surcharge component had a 3-year window lock on it. So you had the surcharge for 3 years and then you're out. This has no window lock. If you earn your position as a negative rated N11 employer, you stay at the higher rate until you either voluntarily contribute or you pay your way out because your business cycle catches up over 10, 12, 15 years and you get ahead of the cycle. So just another policy consideration. I think this probably has the most legs that make the most sense long-term, potentially. So that would be option A, option B, or broader consideration for the 2026 session. So what I have been, actually since session ended and then got involved with the governor's office, trying to identify solutions to these wrinkles, because on the Senate floor, it was announced that we would spend the off session or the next session to identify a long-term solution. And by de facto, I think oftentimes the fingers get pointed back to me and to work with the administration. So we've been two-stepping pretty much the back half of 2025 trying to find this. But the business coalition, I call it option C, call it the broader consideration. The option broader consideration is expanding the temporary unemployment, providing the exemptions for those weather-related carve-outs, look at the surcharge framework and or do the rate table adjustments, sunset the negative debt write-off provisions, coming back to that piece, acknowledging the sub-plans within our statutes, adding and clarifying some statutory definitions, and then we've got some general cleanup that we're looking at as well. So, my gosh, I hope after 20 years, this is the final time that we open UI reform. Secretary Schultz is laughing over here. She's not been along for the full ride. I would acknowledge Natalie Bright from Kansas SHRM. Eric Stafford has been here for the full ride. We have a little bit UI exhaustion, not to play on the earlier term, but we've done a lot of good work, and it would be nice to preserve the work and find the final fix as we move forward. With that, I'll stand for questions.
Okay, so Israel, you awake? Okay, just want to make sure we didn't bore you to death. This is your first stab at this. All right, any questions for Mr. Hayes? I want to better understand subpay. I think I understand it, but what is the difference between subpay and say severance? Because if I get a severance from my company, I'm in a sense getting subpay, but I can't collect unemployment while I look for a job because
your employer doesn't have a sub plan, and so those severance dollars are considered as wages versus benefits under a sub plan.
Any ideas on how to reclassify subpay as wages?
I think we've turned over, I don't know how many stones on this. I know you've worked with USDOL, your counterparts, and looking, and there's just the interplay between the components that we're trying to look at don't work well together.
It just goes against everything that we've ever been taught about unemployment. Or you don't have to look for work and you're getting paid by somebody, but the state's going to pay you to stay home. It makes no sense to me. There's got to be a better way to figure out a way around saving the, I mean, if somebody wants to sit at home and be paid, that I don't blame them for that, I guess, but it shouldn't be on the state to have to pay that.
I'll just remind you, it's not on the state, it's on every other employer in the state.
You're right. 100%. My bad. Any comments? Mr. Oswald?
I mean, a lot of this is really feeling like you get a ding in the fender and you're now going to replace the whole car a little bit. I mean, that's kind of that's the feel I got. Now, I haven't been in on the inner workings of all this, so I don't know what the motivation and what the goal is. But if the goal is to give them a work search wage, that's easy, right? But I guess there's more motivation here that after the 8 weeks of unemployment, then they want the sub plan to kick in. And I don't know how you're legally ever going to get that done because, correct me if I'm wrong, the secretary can correct me if I'm wrong, but the USDOL is very clear that a benefit is not a taxable wageable occurrence. That's a benefit. It's like your health insurance, right? So I don't know. When I was listening to all this, it just seemed like we're jumping through a lot of hoops to accomplish one thing. Not that I'm opposed to work search waivers. Don't get me wrong. I think they're a very valuable tool it's a win-win usually for employee, employer, and for the state. But I don't know. That's just my comments. So take it for what you want.
Madam Secretary.
Thank you. In our cursory look at one of the proposal to change the rate tables, I would love to have some more discussions on that, because one of the things that I think would help us as an agency is it would not require additional programming. We already have the rate tables built in, whereas we do not have a surcharge function built in.
Yeah, I think in initial discussions, at least on my part, the surcharge is going to be too complicated and also too punitive, I think. So if anything, I mean, we're going to come back and undo the forgiveness of negative debt anyway. We could also install a couple of more rating lines and or increase some rates. Be much easier and less punitive, and that way they'd be paid over a longer period of time. All right, so I'm not seeing any other questions. Are there comments? My plan is not to vote on anything, because the whole idea of this council really is just to kind of bounce ideas off of each other. And then when we get back in session, it'll be up to the Commerce Committees in the House and the Senate to make the decisions on what we do with a bill or not, or no bill at all. And most of them, I think, will be listening to this if they haven't already. If they aren't listening right now, my committee anyway will be, everyone on there will listen to this. So they'll take it all into account. Is there any other closing comments, or anyone from DOL have any ideas on any of the questions that we had? Representative Vestas.
Thank you. I'm not quite on topic of what you just asked, but I just want to thank everybody who put some hard work in to this. Phil, how you keep all of that in your head always and can rattle it off again is always impressive. Secretary, thank you for the progress that we've made as well. But it's just a lot to process through of what makes the good common sense. So I'm really glad we're having this discussion. Thank you for bringing us together today.
All right, I think we're out here early on a Phil Bill day. Can you believe that?